It's my great pleasure to moderate this panel. I've reached the stage in life where I'm generally called upon to moderate panels because I think people realize that, I'm not doing any original research and coming up with new findings to share. And that since, I've done this and that, it's all right to have me as a chair. But I actually enjoy that role enormously because I've been learning a lot. I just returned after 2 days in Kathmandu where I learned a phenomenal amount about business and human rights. I mean, I worked for 22 years in the United Nations, and I did not know that there is a working group on business and human rights in the United Nations, of which one of the people associated with our university, Surya Deva, is a member. And they've been doing very, very interesting work, especially on the gender dimensions of business and human rights. And so after a very lively gender panel, I can see that there are serious concerns on the part of businesses about how they perceive gender issues. So therefore, again, I'm here in a position where I've got a great deal to learn from a very distinguished set of people on this panel. And it's a bit, none of us has wrapped our heads quite around what the theme is. In a sense, it says, overcoming financial downturns to reaching a frictionless economy, challenges and opportunities. Now there are many things I need clarification. The expression frictionless economy, for one, I'm not clear whether it's at all desirable or whether it conveys very much what is a frictionless economy. But the general drift is things are looking a bit gloomy. There is a downturn in the economy. There are serious concerns about the state of our financial and our banking sector. People need to get their heads around what is the relationship between the financial sector and its downturn or performance that's not up to mark, and the real economy, so-called. Every time some minister has to contend with the question, he'd say, no, the fundamentals are sound. As if that, that we all know very clear what are the fundamentals of the economy and how maybe this is, even though we are talking about a seriously capitalist system, there seems to be some suggestion that there are something that's fundamental, like the economic base, and then there is a superstructure of all of the other things that follow from it and that don't actually make a big difference to the mode of production and the fundamentals of the economy in a Marxist sense. So I don't understand these comments. When someone in a capitalist system says that even though the financial sector is looking gloomy, the fundamentals of the economy are sound, how does that square? Considering that we know that finance is the lubricant for the economic engine, and if that's full of grit and problems, you don't, you assume that there'll be something wrong with the fundamentals. So anyway, I'm not really an expert in any of these things, so I'll leave it to our wonderful panel to elucidate. But because I started off on this sort of a macroeconomic note, there's fiscal policy, there's monetary policy, there's macro policy, there's micro policy. I wanted to start off with Geetima Das Krishna to lead us off, not in the order in which the panel is here, because she's a macroeconomist, and these are, in a sense, it's nice to begin with these macro questions. And she's, done research on the Indian bond market and on Indian exports, and she's in the Institute of Foreign Trade. Previously, she was in the Macroeconomic Research Unit at the Center for Policy Research. And she's worked in capital asset management company, so we've got, she's got a long bio data, which I won't take too much time reading to you, except that to say that, she's an engineer, really, and then came into finance and investment with a degree from the City University in New York. So, Geetima, you got to set the stage for us, and then we'll follow with the other panelists. So, if you could sit there, maybe. Yeah. You can choose to go up there. Yeah, okay. You wish to go there?
Good afternoon, everybody. Respected chair and the co-panelists, ladies and gentlemen, and the students. So first of all, thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity to come to this event. I don't know how much time we have to start.
We'll take about 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
And then we'll have another round.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. So I'll start off with the macro. So I see that the theme of this event is 5 trillion Indian economy. So is it achievable? Government thinks that deadline is like 2024, we will be a 5 trillion economy. Considering our economic growth came down to 5% last quarter, is it possible? Like in 2007, we became $1 trillion economy, and after 60 years after our independence. And then in 2014, we became $2 trillion economy, just in 7 years. So we are now 2.8 trillion economy. So we are planning to be a $5 trillion economy in 2024, which is like in 14 years, we are expected to grow 5 times, which is remarkable achievement by any standard. So with the growth now slowing down to 5%, even if we think that average growth for the next 5 years will be 6.5, we will definitely reach 5 trillion, if not by 2024, at least by 2026. But the debate now is whether the slowdown is structural or cyclical, whether there are demand side issues or the supply side issues. That's what the debate is all about. So we need to, let me break it down for you. So we have to go back to what are the components of start from the basics. I don't know how many of you are from economics. So growth is GDP, or the growth is basically like you have the public expenditure, that is the government expenditure, then you have private consumption, then the private investment, and the net exports. So what's happening? Growth hasn't slowed down suddenly last quarter. First quarter of this fiscal. It has been slowing down from the last 5 quarters. And investment hasn't picked up for quite a few years. There are various reasons for investment not picking up. There are the NPAs in the banks, which is a legacy issue. From 2011 to 12, the banks were piling up with the NPAs, so they could not lend. Then the large infra companies, they had stressed balance sheet, so they were not investing. So the government did the right thing. They were trying to do capital expenditure, increase public spending so that the growth picks up. And so the private investment wasn't happening within this GDP structure. So what was driving growth? Growth was basically being driven by consumption. Consumption was growing at around 7% for the last 5 years. So it was the only engine which was firing the growth. And so last quarter, when the consumption crashed to 3%, everyone was worried. But there were early signs. We all know, we are reading the newspapers how the car sales are coming down, the SUV sales are down, FMCG sales are down, biscuit sales are down. So this gives you the indication that consumption is coming down. And there are various reasons for it. The rural distress, which is a real one, because of the poor agriculture sector. Then there are other non-farm activities like construction, real estate, which are also there are problems in those sectors. So the rural income is down. What is happening in the urban sector, the income growth is not happening. So, and then there are jobs are not being created. I mean, the aspirational jobs. the right jobs. That's why and then the data now shows that Indian consumers were dipping into their savings to maintain their consumption. And it cannot be sustained. And when the sentiment goes down, they will stop consuming. They will start saving. So this is what is happening. There is a wealth destruction. You can see every day that Sensex is coming down. You are finance students, so you see, you track the market. So what does it mean? It means a wealth destruction for the people. They lose confidence, and then the consumption also comes down. So consumption, so that basically consumption is down, investment has been down for a long time. So what happens to the exports? We don't think exports is going to help. We don't have the tailwind of global growth this time because global growth is coming down. There is US-China trade war, and so exports are not going to take off anytime soon. So that leaves us with nothing. Like, it's a very sad situation. And when we had the banking NPA problem, the NPAs were just getting better, just that when the ILFS thing happened last year. So now the NBFCs have a problem. So as the chair already said, that finance is the lubricant of our economy. So if the finance sector has a problem, then of course the whole economy will have to deal with it, try to come out of it. So now this, how the technology can help us get back our growth. Can technology help in getting back the frictionless economy that we talk about, doing away with the middleman? Can it help to rebuild our growth? Now, why did it come down so soon? One of the main reasons is India tried to formalize the informal economy in a very fast way. Right? With demonetization, GST, and everything, there is a huge parallel economy, an informal economy. And when you try to formalize that economy, suddenly there are chaos. It's a good reform, which will give a good dividend maybe going forward, but not immediately. There will be chaos. Then there are the problematic implementation of GST, which they are trying to work on. Then there are high real interest rates. And of course, the banking sector problem. So there are many reasons for it. So what the government can do? There are many levers which are used to boost growth. There are 4 basic levers. One is the monetary policy, one is the fiscal policy, the other is exchange rate and reforms. So fiscal policy is nothing but increasing government spending. Can government increase spending? No, right? They don't have this fiscal space. With the growth slowing down, the tax collection will also come down. So they will not have anything to spend on. It is true that RBI gave them a large dividend, but it will only fill up the gap to a certain extent. And there are huge disinvestment budgeted, which they have not even started. So they don't have the space to give fiscal boost. And fiscal boost is essential for quick turnaround. When you give money to the people's hand, they immediately spend or do something. So the consumption starts. So the fiscal boost is essential for quick turnaround, which is not there this time. So what the government can do is they can quickly maybe, they can sell the asset sell, they can start selling the assets of the PSUs and front load the infrastructure building. Then monetary policy, they have been doing the heavy lifting. They have been cut rates. They have given dividends. They have done everything. But then the monetary policy always works after a lag. It takes some time for the monetary policy, impact of monetary policy to kick in. Maybe by next 2-3 months, we will see the impact. Then the exchange rate, we know that rupee has depreciated, but we can't let it depreciate a lot. We have seen that what happened in Saudi Arabia, and then oil prices have gone up. Aramco was attacked. The 5% of the world oil production has gone down. So the oil prices have gone up, and we import 70% of our oil. So we cannot let our exchange rate depreciate a lot. So that's also gone. Then we have reforms. Now, reforms, the government is doing a lot on reforms, but then reforms and turnaround, quick turnaround, have a tenuous relationship. Even in 91, when the reform started, the growth went down drastically initially, and it took up only after 3 years. So we can't say it will have a rich dividend going forward, but not immediately. But whatever, so the next 2 quarters growth will be slower, around 6%. So the overall growth, maybe it will pick up by the end of the third quarter and the fourth quarter. So overall growth rate, we are expecting around, say, 6%. And so as everything, the lower interest rate, lower cost of capital, high liquidity, everything kicks in, the sentiment improves. And hopefully the oil prices will also come down, because they are saying that within a month it will stabilize. So by then, I think it should be, by next year, we will be in a much firmer footing, and $5 trillion will be achievable. And with I think the next panelist will be talking about the technology, and we will see how technology will help in boosting growth.
Thank you very much. That's exactly what I wanted you to set the ground for the discussions in this panel. I'd now like to invite Mr. Vijay Sardana. Now he's there's Professor Shiv Vishwanathan in our university makes a distinction between public intellectuals. By that he means people like Mr. Vijay Sardana who, write, blog, are on television, educating the public, and so on. But he contrasts, and Shiv, of course, styles himself as a public intellectual too. But he would say that there's another category which he calls policy intellectuals, who actually do get their hands dirty and do some work with the government and so on. I mean, in Shiv's estimation, that's another category. It's another sort of a somewhat lower caste of intellectuals. But what I admire about Mr. Vijay Sardana is that he's both. He's both a policy intellectual and a public intellectual, in the sense of educating the public, speaking out on issues of concern, but at the same time, working on the Commodity Derivatives Advisory Committee of SEBI. Now, that's hard work. I mean, it's not fashionable and so on, but it's very important work to be working on the Forward Market Commission, to be a board member of Nabiscan, which is a financial subsidiary of NABARD. He's the chairman of the IT and Cybersecurity Committee of the board. He's a member of the Risk Management Committee of the board. He's on the board of directors of the National Commodities and Derivatives Exchange. So it's that combination that I think is desirable. It's all very well to say, oh, we will speak truth to power, but very often we have to speak the truth about power, and to learn how power works. You've got to be an insider. You can't be a total outsider speaking truth to power. So that's why I welcome a personality like Vijay Sardana. So with those words, sir, would you please share your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you very much, sir, for inviting. और बाकी अभी आप बहुत कुछ इंटेलेक्चुअल डिस्कशन करेंगे. सर ने जैसे कहा कि मैं ग्राउंड पे काम करता हूँ. आई एम ऑल्सो एडवाइजर टू पोल्ट्री फेडरेशन. आई वर्क विद कमोडिटी फार्मर्स. आई वर्क विद ट्रेडर्स. आई वर्क विद इंडस्ट्री. एंड सून आफ्टर दिस आई एम गोइंग टू the TV studio for discussion on economic issues and Mr. Modi's US visit. Whatever exists in economy, please understand one simple thing. Whatever exists in economy exists for a purpose. Nothing exists in system if there is no purpose. Logic is very simple. Life is not complicated. Life is very simple. Stick to common sense. Don't make life complicated. N number of product people launch, they fail. N number of policy decisions we take, there is no action on ground on those policies because they was not required. They were not required. Then why we are doing all this? When you're talking of frictionless economy, then why friction exists? There's a reason behind it. Everybody knows friction is bad, but they still exist. It means they are serving some purpose. So if you're trying to make frictionless economy, what will happen to people, those who thrive and live on frictions? That is also part of economy. They also contribute to GDP. So if you are trying to work out an alternate to frictional factors into the economy, then what is the alternate? Are those alternate better than the existing or inferior than the existing? Take a classical example of banking system in rural India. We are talking of finance. We are talking of economy. Still, traditional Artiya exists, whereas the low interest cost banking system failed. Why? And if you look into so-called, that's what I'm trying to say, please understand your definition of friction. Your definition of friction is entirely different than what I experience on market. Unless you understand this gap, no policy intervention and no research will be of no use, of any use to anyone. And the biggest problem with policy making bodies and institutions in India is they all work on secondary data, which itself is fictitious. So you are taking a secondary data, secondary information based on a data which is cooked up data. Most of the institutions, sorry to use this word, harsh word in the system, because when we go to the ground, what we see there and what we look into the Government of India data, there is no match. If I ask a very simple question, what is the oilseed production in India? Every agency will have a different data. What is the corn production in India? Nobody knows. Then we say we are working on agroeconomy, we are working on policy, we are working on farmer income, without knowing what is happening. Today the crisis which you are facing is onion. Prices are shooting up. You ask Government of India one data, what is the total onion demand in the country? There is no data. Then how do you know supply is enough or not? In this imperfect and half-cooked economic analysis, you will bound to have frictions. Because I know as a trader, that there is bound to be demand. Whatever Government of India says, I am sitting in Mandi, I know what is the total crop. I don't consume because I am looking at data. I look at ground reality, what is happening here, then as a trader I decide whether I should hoard the product or I should not buy the product or I discount the product or I charge premium. That's hardcore economics on ground. Whatever you write on book, I have no meaning, books or papers or research paper, it has no meaning on ground. And that is where when you say there is a friction in the system. No, it's not friction. It is your wrong interpretation of the factual position on ground. You may classify as a friction. You may classify it as inefficiency. You may say this is some form of a problem in the economy, but I don't consider. If there is a shortage in the system, supply is a constraint and demand is same, and if I'm capitalizing as an economic entity on that opportunity of market, is this friction? I think we have to understand what we are trying to define as friction in the whole system. That's one aspect. We all are talking of economic slowdown. What is the population of India? Today, 1.37 billion. What was last year? 1.35 billion. What will be next year? 1.39 billion. Demand side is increasing. How there can be economic slowdown? One has to think about it. Are all systems in slowdown? I work in the poultry sector. Last month, the poultry was selling at 55 rupees. Today, poultry price is 95. In 15 days, price went by 30 rupees. Any newspaper covering, any research report covering this? No. Last year, maize prices were 13 rupees. Right now, I am looking for maize I'm not getting less than 25 in the market in 1 year, the price is 100% up. Any analysis? Any forecasting by any institution or by government? And when I ask the government of India, why this 100% rise, as per our data, there is no problem in supply side. Then why market is showing 100% rise in the price? Who is right? Market is right, because that's a fact. What you are writing in research paper has no meaning, because nobody is trading on that. Fact of the matter is, let us get out from the jargons and go back to basics. The biggest problem in economic analysis in this country, which is actually huge unorganized economy, we have to look at what is happening on the ground in marketplace instead of research reports. And that is why in most of the agro-commodity associations, let me tell you very honestly, I represent 13 of them. When we plan our businesses or forecast for next 1 year, we don't look at Government of India data at all. We conduct our own surveys and release our own crop forecasting. Why we do it? If the data is so reliable? Because we don't trust. We are in business. If we don't keep ourselves abreast to the ground reality, we will be ruined overnight. It's a commodity business, margins are very thin. So you have to be 100% accurate in your decisions for survival, not because of profit. So what we have to look at is very, very simple, that when you are talking of frictionless economy, first we have to define what is friction, why those so-called friction exist, and if you are trying to make it frictionless economy, who will gain and who will lose? It's a complex economy. And country like India, where too many things are beyond your visualization, 1.37 billion people are 100% consumers of commodities. Okay? They all are eating and surviving. And look at the other side of my last point. When you look into any demand-supply scenario of India, you look at human population. There are also another billion livestock population in this country which is never factored in any policy document when it comes to supply side. So you have to feed 2.37 billion living creatures for existing 365 days. Problem is, when I take as a businessman a wrong decision, when I spend too much money, and all the slowdown you are talking about in this country is all categories which are non-essential. And the logic is very simple. Find out what is the per capita income and how a common man spends whatever income he has into different category. 50% goes for food, 20% goes for housing and security, 20% goes for education and healthcare and transportation. Leftover income is 5%. If you have 5% surplus income, and because of your demand supply in 50%, if that 5% goes up or consumed in food, which was going into non-essential activity like entertainment and other things, as a consumer, what I'll do? I'll first cut non-essential. And then you say there is a slowdown in economy. I think that analysis is very different. So time is short. A lot can be discussed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very down-to-earth, common sense. I'd now like to invite Jaivir Singh to kick us off with further thoughts on this. He's a specialist in the field that's known as law and economics. It's a sub-discipline of economics. I don't know whether the lawyers would regard it as a sub-discipline of law, but at least there's a great deal of interest in the part of economists who no longer assume that the law is some mere backdrop and do give some credence to what the law can actually do. in terms of the functioning of an economy. And so he's with the Jawaharlal Nehru University's Center for the Study of Law and Governance. And he is an alumnus, like I am, of the Delhi School of Economics, except that he's got a PhD as well from the Delhi School of Economics. It's not just the MA. And he's also worked in a think tank, which is considered as the #1 think tank. I mean, you know, all these rankings nowadays. So ICRIER is ranked as India's #1 think tank by the group that ranks think tanks. And so he's worked there as well. So let's have your thoughts, Jaiveer.
Thank you very much for inviting me for this event. I don't know how. Let me try saying what how I reacted to the things. I don't have any expertise as such on the digital economy, because some of the things we were supposed to talk about was technology. So I'm building a very keen interest and hope actually to learn a lot more. Rather, in this moment of a talk of a downturn, I'd like to engage with parts of one of the broad questions that's been listed in the website in relation to this panel. And I quote, it says, are the government policies and programs on emerging technologies like AI, digital payments, cryptocurrency, manufacturing like Make in India clear and supportive, or are they counterintuitive? It is the set of policies around manufacturing that I wish to address. And since my own work is centered around labor and labor institutions, that is what I can speak about comfortably here. So in this, the first point that I would like to note is that this government and the previous government all brought in talk about labor laws being too restrictive. The Indian courts have also got swayed by this discourse, so that today there are many avenues through which labor rights are constrained, particularly in the realm of tenure. This whole idea that we must have a sort of a regime in which one should be able to easily adjust the labor market. Now, as we all know, there is very widespread use of contract labor as a consequence of this. And because I've tried to deal with contract labor, I'd search for a theoretical framework through which one can start thinking about this. And I've sort of tried to work with a branch of economics, which I'll just quickly put out, which is not mainstream, which is mainstream, and it is not radical. So, because one is from JNU, you know, it is assumed that, radicalism should be growing out of one's ears. But, you know, there is the set of arguments that which you can make, which argue for labor rights on efficiency grounds, and not because you want to make a radical cause for labor rights on grounds of equality. This basically draws from the theory of incomplete contracts. In the context of labor, the argument goes something like this. At some time period, and I have my full economist hat right now, zero, both employers and employees will invest in a relationship-specific investment. Now, if in time period 1, they will both be able to partake of the jointly gained surplus that has come from the investment in the first time period. And because of this second time period sharing, there is a way in which efficiency results are sensitive to the nature of distribution of rights. In other words, investment in human capital depends very much on regimes that see results over a long period, to cut the jargon out. This kind of thinking, which has been brought into prominence by people like Oliver Hart, who recently, though he got the Nobel Prize, is not something which is very much hyped in policy circles because it's not easy to convert this into sound bites. So one of the things that we are talking about policy and so on and so forth, so, insight, the kind of thing that was said by the previous speaker, if he is talking about this in the context of, futures markets, commodity markets and so on and so forth, it is equally true of all other ways in which we think about things. Now, be that as it may, it is essential for me to invoke this in the context of Skill India, which is such an integral part of this Make in India. And I'm sure this audience knows all about this, the components of this, sort of Skill India. But let me very briefly, talk about two things. One dimension of this Skill India is very old. It's like the timeless intervention to the skilling problem. India has attempted its own system of apprenticeship by legislating the Apprenticeship Act in 1961, which made it obligatory for a set of employers to engage apprentices in designated trades and contribute towards setting up training institutes. These apprentices are trained in organizations called ITIs and industrial training centers, and thereafter some of them are employed for a short duration by employers who participate in the apprenticeship endeavor. This arrangement is quite far removed from the standard systems of apprenticeship that you have in other parts of the world, such as Germany, where it is supposed to result in something, where apprentices can look forward to a long-term relationship with employers. It's the case that in recent times, attempts have been made to refurbish this, but not really taking care of this long-term relationship. The second round of things, the National Policy on Skill Development, set up this from 2015. They got a separate ministry on skill development and entrepreneurship. And the current government has seen to it that the ministry has initiated a whole series of programs to skill the Indian labor force. Broadly speaking, the point and the spirit behind these programs is to encourage public-private partnerships in the area of skilling. The government funds entrepreneurs who in turn skill workers in collaboration with employers and are refunded by the government on the basis of their performance. Now, it's impossible for me in this kind of a thing to actually go back, to put out a comprehensive view of what has happened as a consequence of this. But I'd like to actually quote a very, very recent article from the Indian Journal of Labor Economics. It's called Skills, Training and Employment Outcomes in Rural Bihar, by one Bhaskar Chakraborty and one Arjun S. Bedi, who both of them students in some European universities. And the blurb, or whatever the abstract, says this: we find that the training program squarely reaches the intended target group, rural poor youth. Initially, the program leads to a 29 percentage point increase in the employment rate of the trained graduates. However, 2 to 6 months after the training, the employment effect of the program drops to zero. A third of the placed graduates leave their jobs due to caste-based discrimination. Another third leave due to a mismatch between the salaries offered and their living costs. The upshot is that while the training program enhances job market prospects, other labor market factors undo the positive effects. Employers look I'll conclude soon. Employers look for workers who are appropriately skilled to perform the task on hand, and workers for jobs where their ability and training will give them commensurate returns. In this, the job of matching the appropriately skilled worker with the correct employer, which is referred to as the matching problem in economics, is of central concern. It needs to be realized that skilling requires expenditure. In fact, there are investment decisions made by both the worker and the employer with the anticipation of a stream of returns. If expected returns are not reasonably guaranteed and therefore a sustained match is not engineered, such investment is bound to be stalled by the worker and the employer. To overcome such market failure, institutional innovation to nudge the process is vital. It's nevertheless possible that the institutional intervention can be infructuous unless it is carefully provides the right incentives for long-term investment and commitment by the concerned parties. In our Skill India of endeavor, you are generating employment for a few months. And it involves a particular kind of investment which is really actually, it's rent-seeking for entrepreneurs in a big way. And these people who then are trained like that are then a part of the same labor force with, skills which will give them returns, not give them returns. So I don't know. I mean, I know this is a very long-winded sort of a thing to say, but, in a certain sense, to develop human capital is an important endeavor for a country like India, but without sufficient thought of how to make it sustained, to realize that there is an investment component. Investments, as you all, I think, some students who are associated with banking and finance and so on and so forth, well, an investment must get a return into the future. So with this,
Thank you very much. Now I have great pleasure in introducing to you Dr. Subhi Chaturvedi. She's a favorite in the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy and in the School of Banking and Finance. We invited her to speak to students and faculty, and we all still remember what she said on those occasions. She's, there was Shashi Tharoor came recently to our university and gave one of these 10th anniversary talks very recently. And he published a book called The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone. This is about, the great transformations in India. And in his view, of course, the cell phone has been a great transformative thing. I mean, it's become the extension of our personalities. It's reached out into rural India in ways that even the Dalda could not reach in the days when it was held up as the great marketing achievement of Hindustan Lever and Mr. Tandon. As she's worked as a senior person, a director in the Cellular Operators Association of India. And when she was in that position, when she talked to us first, subsequently she's moved on. She went on to become the senior president of the Yes Bank Institute, which is a think tank of that bank. I gather now you've done your bit there and you've moved on a bit. So it's a multifaceted personality, I mean, that Subhi is, and she's taught journalism and communication in LSR, so, there's a certain appreciation that we have of, in that sense, a fellow academic. She's got a doctorate from the IIT in Delhi, and is, the kind of a dream of a public policy school person. I mean, very interdisciplinary, with an understanding of psychology, commerce, economics. So we'd like you to throw some light on this problem. It's like there's this elephant and we are all touching parts of it and figuring out what the whole might look like. That's why it seems to me. But we have Ram, who will now, at the end, draw the full picture. So let's not despair. And Subhi will throw enough light to get us going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Sudarshan, who I think is one of my most favorite people on this planet, and for many reasons. I consider myself incredibly blessed because I've had the opportunity to traverse many lives in many spheres, and like he said, I wear many hats, and when I come to Jindal, your school, it's almost like homecoming, and I see many familiar faces. Why do I feel so excited? Because I'm speaking to young minds, and most of all, I see many young women in the room, and they're not just women who they're feisty, they have an opinion, they have a mind of their own. When we look at the world of public policy, it's often riddled with engineers, it's also riddled with acronyms. Having broken through the world of finance, as it were, investment banking, policy making. I think what's important today, when we look at the problem facing us, we're talking about a $5 trillion economy, and many of us have seen it as audacity, many of us see it as a possibility. I think Gitima's outlined the numbers very, very succinctly. So what I want to do, we talked about the elephant, I want to start my conversation with you with a small story of 5 monkeys. I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Stephenson's experiment in 1962. He put 5 monkeys in a box, a rather large cage, and there were bananas at the top, they were out of reach, and there was a ladder. And each time a monkey tried climbing up the ladder or reaching up, they were sprayed with water, ice cold water. Okay, this was probably in New York, and the monkeys didn't like the experience. They started replacing 1 monkey at a time, and there was a point in time when none of the monkeys had ever been sprayed with water, but yet each time a monkey tried going up the ladder, the other monkeys pulled that monkey down. A lot of our policy making experience has been a bit like that. The conversations which must be had for a $5 trillion economy, or the conversations around regulatory policy, first start with the premise and the hypothesis that these are elected parliamentarians who must not and cannot be questioned because all repository, all wisdom resides with them. That is the first premise we question. Whether in the field of banking, so I'm a non-engineer, I did not study finance. I did take up economic policy and 5-year planning and strategy as part of my coursework when I was studying at IIT. But I love to read. I've read anthropology, I do photography, I do filmmaking, and I continue to read and write. I think it's important that we start challenging this premise first. There are extremely well-meaning bureaucrats, but as you know, a joint secretary would have an average span of about 3 years in a ministry. A secretary, if he's lucky, about 1.5 years, and the latter part is occupied with administrative responsibilities of logistics and operations. And these are nice people. They're well-meaning people. But like we say, the road to hell is often paved with good intentions. Parents believe, shadi kar lo, acha hai, it's good for you. A lot of these decisions and policies are intuitive, but some of them are counterintuitive as well. When we look at the speed of change, from the time that I walked into this room, about 30,000 new people have come online. That's the speed of change. We're talking about internet terms, internet numbers. And when we talk about disruptive technologies, we've talked about friction. One of the most important conversations that I've had is with that of the regulator of my sector. When we were at a point in time when it was extreme amount of conflict, we had a new operator who believed that they were a startup, but they were the wealthiest startup in the country, and I speak to Reliance Jio. When they launched their operations, all the others ran helter-skelter because nobody had figured that kind of space, that kind of ability to look at spaces and maneuver a truck through them that this giant of a startup came with when it came to telecommunications and policy. So I've had these conversations. They may be anecdotal evidence to you today when people say that they're spending about 30% of their monthly income on data at a point in time, because that was important. Being on Facebook was important. Vis-a-vis traditional wisdom, which would say if you don't have roti in your belly, then you would not want to go online. But when we look at a world which is Orwellian, when we look at a world which is about consumption, And we look at economic policy where the speed of our aspiration and the size of our hopes is much larger than capacity. We also need to start looking at what kind of policy ecosystems that India needs. Not what India has, but what is desirable. Why is it there's a crisis of investment? Because there's been instances when largest telecommunication corporations of the world have faced retrospective taxation. My job as a public policy professional has been to engage with all stakeholders. And in public policy, be it investment, banking, finance, economics, they're largely for stakeholders. There's the private sector who will always be welcomed by the government. They will always have a seat at the table. The government may choose to take all your inputs or they may not. They may discard a lot of those inputs, but they will be in the room. Then there's academia, which is often trying to maneuver, budge, persist, knock down doors to be in the room, because it's important that original research, which is not based on fictitious data, is there for the government to base their policies on. Otherwise, there will be an interested party which will have a conflict of interest, i.e. the private sector, and the government, which is keen on sourcing investment, and that is how policy making will happen. So one of the biggest crises that and that's why my engagement with Jindal has been consistent whenever I could facilitate it, is the ability to foster original research, credible research, which is also of use to the government, the policymaker, and business. Private sector will always look at profit motives. So this is not an esoteric world, this is not an ideal world. Now, having said that, the test of a good regulation, and which is where regulators are struggling, not just in India, but globally, is how do you make space for regulation which is stable, which is predictable, which is investment friendly, that allows people to invest without the fear of looking at retrospective changes in policy, which can set them back by millions of dollars. And a couple of announcements where the government has taken steps back has had that impact, where people have said, we were committed to investing $5 billion US, but we're going to hold, we're going to wait and watch. So crisis and risk, as a public policy professional, as someone who's looked at the interdisciplinarity of things. So when you study economics and finance and banking and investment, you also need to look at political economy. You also need to look at psephology. You also need to look at sociology. So there are great products which get launched, but they also fail because marketing was intact, strategy was intact, but nobody had looked at policy risks. So stability in policy. And here's the conundrum. This is where we're not prepared. We also need to look at regulatory sandboxes which allow for innovation to happen. When innovation happens, and I've been on TV and I've written extensively about it, blockchain is good, but cryptocurrency is bad. Okay? So if there is an instrument of exchange or legal tender, and then there is technology, the understanding of technology and the ability to grapple with what are the levers of change is extremely critical when we're looking at emerging economy. When AI happened, and I'm sure Ram will speak more to that, but I live and breathe this space, and therefore I'm extremely passionate about it. When we're talking about emerging technologies, the natural instinct, and I don't speak to one government in particular, is control. We want to know as much as possible, and we want to know as minute a detail as possible about the population or its citizens. But what is equally important is the ability to push back and say, when we're a multi-stakeholder form of governance, especially when it comes to the digital economy, because this is one place where the government really does not know more than people who made the internet possible. So as far as telecom is concerned, we've had national telecom policies. We've had the government as the licensee to run and operate those infrastructure ecosystems. But when it comes to digital economy and the internet in particular, it's functioned because there are 4 values. It's open, it is permissionless, it allows for interoperability, and the internet is inherently a champion of human rights. The day that the government or agencies which were elected, and that would be the Westphalian model of governance, and the idea is that somebody or one of the stakeholders knows more than you is when we run into problems. So had ARPANET not existed and had Windsurf and Tim Berners-Lee, the fathers of the internet, not given up their stake in their claim, the internet would not be what it is today. So when we're looking at technologies now, which are apps, which are solving problems. So mobility, to help you get from place A to B faster, to deliver food, to make sure that they're able to solve social problems, to make better human connections. We have to understand that innovation will always happen at the fringes. So the test of a good regulation would be, one, to not assume. And I've been at the receiving end. I come from banking, and there's a lot of conversation about banking. We're one of the most heavily regulated sectors that existed. Was everything right, the way we handled disruptions? The inherent assumption that everybody's a chore or everybody's out to steal is not a very conducive or a very healthy idea to policy making. If that's the carrot and stick approach that you wish to take, then we need to start looking at where is it that the outliers who are responsible for innovation will sit. And my last bit is about India's place in the global value chain, and that's the report. We've done a report on skilling, by the way, for NITI. We've done another report on open governance and open data. We've done several reports. I still want to close with the idea that brand India is a remarkable concept. I also want to leave you with the thought, and these are probably my closing comments before I yield. Gandhi was on to something. He was not just a fantastic communicator, but the idea of a digital village with the fiber optic cable network that will collect 250,000 villages and 600,000 villages, 250,000 panchayats is a phenomenal resource. So before the HULs of the world and the Reliances of the world get onto it, we have to do more in terms of capacity building. Like we did the National Saksharta Mission, with the same kind of zeal, we need to look at digital literacy. And brand India, more value in production, not raw material and not raw production and agriculture. We're doing something really right. $450 billion in investment as far as electronic manufacturing is concerned. So mobile is a space because you've got some intelligent public policy professionals there. The government is doing everything possible to make India a hub for manufacturing, electronics manufacturing in India. But similar kind of engagement is still required in many sectors, and simplification of policy making is something that we still need to look at. But my last bit is about consistently engaging with policymakers, whether you're business or academia or research. And I can't stress enough on the need for interdisciplinarity and views of humanities and liberal arts in policy making, even when it's about finance or engineering or economics. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm sure we'll reconvene our conversation later.
I won't take up time introducing you, Ram. You've been the key person.
Yeah, this is when you say he needs no introduction, right? Don't take it literally though. So I have been asked to put light on the elephant, right? Professor Sudarshan, you said I had to put light on the elephant. So what is the elephant in the room? Is there an elephant in the room? What is the elephant in the room? What are we talking about? We're talking about growth, debt, NPA. What's that? What else? What else did we hear the last 2 days? Anything else that we heard about? What else?
Trillion, technology.
We didn't hear technology too much. Downturn, right? So I think that is the elephant in the room, right? So when you talk about elephants, that reminds me of a book I read several decades back, written by Lou Gessner, of the CEO of IBM. He said, who says elephants can't dance, right? So basically it's a story about IBM. Again, IBM is more than a 100 years old company, and it was going through some really rough patches. It was basically shutting down shop. This was in the early 90s. And so the story was about how he helped transform the company, get rid of things that was old and not working, and created a culture that was more conducive to operating in the corporate world and becoming more competitive, right? And so when we are talking about being competitive and being thinking of the future, we can make elephants dance. Okay? And the way to do that is not necessarily always to be looking backwards. I think it is important to look forward. So now I'm talking to the students there in terms of not so much in terms of economic theories and policies. I'm going to give you some my perspective. Again, I don't understand a whole bit of the Indian ecosystem at this point in time. I'm still learning. But what I will say is basically three things. And that kind of resonated over some of the things that I picked up over the last 2 days. So the first thing is the growth and the future lies with your entrepreneurs. The innovation that you folks bring in, and I'm saying you, because you are going to be the agents of change. You have to be thinking about creating new products and services that does not exist today. That's number one, right? And you have to think, yesterday one of the speakers was talking about creating localized applications. Go to the villages and the panchayats and districts and identify problems that you can solve. There is a tremendous amount of market there, tremendous amount of money to be made. Clearly it's going to be hard work, but entrepreneurship is what is going to drive the economic growth of this country. And who is going to do it? It is not going to be probably the people sitting on the stage here, sorry, or the babus and the bureaucrats who came and spoke so eloquently. It's not going to happen. It's going to happen and germinate from you. It's going to end with you. So you are the ones who are going to take that risk and be able to create an ecosystem that is vastly different. So we need to go to a different set of growth engine than what exists today. Cannot be relying talking about agribusiness and creating industries and stuff like that. It has to completely change, right? And you are the ones who are going to do that. How are you going to do that? Excuse me. That's my point number two. What is going to drive that is the digital infrastructure. Some of you probably learned from my class, we are in the fourth industrial revolution now. There is a whole bunch of changes happening in terms of how businesses are run, how businesses are going to be run into the future. And all of them are going to depend on these emerging technologies, right? Which Subi talked about mobile technology, which is going to be the fundamental in terms of digital infrastructure, but also things like artificial intelligence, things like Internet of Things, things like fintech and blockchain, and so many more, right? You need to think about how these different technologies, so first thing is I would strongly recommend is that as you're thinking in a very entrepreneurial way, think about how these technologies are actually going to help change and work together. How it's going to change a business, whether it is the example of the flower lady yesterday in Calcutta who is selling flowers. How can we apply some very specific technologies for her to improve her life and improve to her to become a better entrepreneur, right? You need to go local and think about those technologies and see how it can come together, right? So embrace technology, but not necessarily I'm talking about coding and programming and etc. I'm talking about understanding how technologies operate and how it can be used. So learn about that. That is going to be the tool for the future for you. So we talk about all skill India and all those things. You guys are going to focus on the future. The skills of the future are going to be completely digital, and that's what you're going to be embarking on. So make sure that you embrace that. That's what is going to drive you forward. The third thing before I stop my opening comment is that the policies. Sorry. I'm an engineer, I'm a finance person, but I don't know anything about it. So I will talk about something that I don't know about. The policies in terms of what how this has been put together in terms of developing these structural changes that we are talking about now, Make in India, all these slogans that come out, and all the different work that has been done by the government is focusing on providing these broad brush statements, whether it is in terms of, if I look at the white paper that have been developed on artificial intelligence, whether the white paper that has been written on fintech, and so on and so forth, there are a lot of good, well-intended statements there. So what do you do with it? And that's where I fail to understand how we can talk about creating these 31% investment levels and not really get into the specifics of saying, how are we going to create the digital infrastructure for the future, for you folks, right? And so I think, besides these economists and the academicians and others, and the business and the industry groups, I think they need to have dialogues with young students like you. So you guys need to prepare and go to the government, whoever it is, and it can be facilitated. You folks need to go with your proposals, say this is what we really want. And that probably is a way to push this dialogue forward and in a more tangible, meaningful way. Otherwise, like Mr. Sivasailam said yesterday, every % drop in GDP is actually, you're losing 2.5 million jobs. And that is gone forever. And you are going to be in the firing line in the next year, 2 years, right? So you folks need to think about it in a little more strategic fashion, in a long-term fashion, rather than in a, thinking about what happens in the next 1 year, 2 years. This is your career, this is your life, so grab it. It's for you. That's it.
Thank you. Now, if there was more time than we have, one of the responsibilities of the chair is to pull threads together and so on. But I have to leave it to you now. Conventionally, we would have questions and answers, and with the diversity of topics that we've covered in this panel, there could be a diversity of questions, but we don't have the time. So I want your consent for us to have our panelists say a few parting reflections, having heard one another. So I'm sorry, we don't have because the next session is to begin, and we have Rajiv Kumar coming along. So I want, if there are some pressing questions, we could take a couple of them, but I really would like to have the panelists reflect a little bit about what we just heard before we close. So is there anyone with a burning question? I mean, I've been discouraging the question, but you also have the right to ask the question. So
I can throw one. I'm not sure how burning it is, though.
yes, do.
Thank you. So my question is actually about data. And it's important to ask this panel because I feel what you spoke is extremely important to this concern I have. As a technologist, engineer, public policy professional, pure academic, we've been talking a lot about data, but I feel, and this is in the context of the theme of our conclave, the reliability of data, quality of data, and access to data is paramount. It could be to understand agricultural markets. It could be to inform policymakers. It could be definitely to understand macroeconomic indicators better, labor markets for sure, to understand how investments can flow into startup ecosystem, understanding patent filings, all of that. So and we don't do very well on this front in India. You alluded to that, I completely agree with you. So if you were to place a recommendation in front of the decision maker, the policy maker, what would it be to ensure that the data we end up using or seeing, which by the way includes this $5 trillion goal, how can we make our data a little bit more reliable, accurate, believable, and accessible?
I think it's a very fundamental question for any meaningful policy or any meaningful action plan on ground. I feel what we have to do is we have to change the way we look at the policy analysis or policy priorities, because there's a lot of political interference and that leads to the interference or manipulations of data. Today you have two important aspects to look at, and that will help solve this problem a great deal. You have a technology. If you are talking of ground level countrywide technology, you have a space technology, remote sensing, and so many things to map the activities. Second, you have a people, those who have a stake in the business, which are associations. Any wrong information will hurt them the first. It doesn't hurt any MP or MLA or any vote bank at all, but it hurts their existence. Unless policymakers and institutions create a dedicated forum, don't ask one agency to do everything for the country because things are too complex. If you
Thank you. Is there anyone who wants to make a comment?
I just want a very small Twitter comment, and that is not to disappoint you when you go out of this room, and not to tell you everybody's a thief and everybody's going to lie and all your data is spurious. The idea is, look at individual examples and also look at what is around you. Don't be blind when it comes to the realities facing you. And it's not an ideal utopian world, but there's always space for outliers, and there is also space for unique individual approaches to business, governance, and policy making. Because of the fact that I've succeeded, and there have been some very large policy issues where we've got the government of India to change its position. We've got 2 young people for the first time on the United Nations Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group, because we said that you're not just users, you're consumers, and you're also people who need to be involved in policy making. So change is possible. We've got Government of India to shift from a multilateral only to a multi-stakeholder approach to internet governance, which means if you're not going to be on the table, you will be on the menu. It is your job, and you'll be doing great disservice to yourself if you don't engage, and only you're responsible for that. So that's just something that I wanted to say in closing comments, because it's path forward. Okay, thank you.
Right. Just as, because what you said a little while ago, react to each other or thing. One thing that we talked about elephants and so on and so forth. One elephant in the room, and I think there's a kind of a way in which, Dr. Krishna made a mention of it, you made a mention about it, and so did you, in a thing. There is a kind of desire to wish away the informal market. And that's really a part of the problem of current times, and why we are sitting here possibly, and these things, because this is a country we are simultaneously also a developing country. There are many people in great levels of poverty, and so on and so forth. And they are functioning in an informal market, and this desire to wish it away is probably more damaging rather than something which there's this continuing acceptance and it's your comment that it's a long-term solution, and one should push for it, but to get it overnight,
Thank you. So,
Yeah. And all this talk is primarily directed at the students, and you have to basically look at these policy considerations as well as your own entrepreneurial spirit to ensure that your future is not put at stake, whether it is because of incorrect data, whether it is because of lack of access to finances, whether it is lack of government policies. I think that rests primarily with you. Okay?
yeah, okay. So we can have tea. Just 2 thoughts, having listened to the panelists. I have to say that a great deal of the economy of Jammu and Kashmir depends on the internet. A lot of the sales of Kashmiri carpets and dry fruits, walnuts, whatever, happens through the internet. And now, for whatever reason, if the internet is shut down in a state where the stated objective of the government is to bring more prosperity and peace to that state, it's a very worrisome thing. So we have a great champion of the freedom of the internet in Subi, who is served on the United Nations panel for the governance of the internet. So it's something that we all value. So I think we must all, for whatever, Kashmir is just an example which is very poignant at this point in time for the economic damage that the shutdown of the internet has done to that state. But for all other things as well, I think we must, and that's the future, all of us must safeguard and value and cherish the freedom there is in the governance of the internet at the moment. All people in power would like to seize it and diminish that freedom, but that's one space there is in a world, all over the world, that we must safeguard. That's one technology that, as Subi pointed out, could have been made part of intellectual property and patented, but it was not. And that's a blessing that all of us have. So I leave that thought with you. The other thought I had is that, the reference was made to the growing population of India and the size of this country. It's all very well for an economy like Japan to actually promote robots and get robots to do a lot of the work, because that's an aging society. In Japan, the population is declining. But that couldn't be the way forward for an economy like ours, where a lot of young people have to be engaged, because work is an expression of our freedom and our creativity. And if we don't have meaningful work, we are diminished as human beings. And that's a very fundamental right that we should cherish as human beings. And therefore, we have to think about the policies that get talked about in a very loose manner about modern technology and how it could do wonders. But we are a country where there are a large number of young people, and all of us need to have meaningful and creative work. Thank you.